demographics is a long word for the characteristics of people, and so that deals with age, gender, ethnicity, race, and stage of life. And what demographics allow you to do is to think about people in place and the various roles that they play over their lifetime in terms of both their need for and their provision of either services or labor. So that's how we think about it, is that people need services, that leads to infrastructure, housing, etc. And at the same time, we think of people as the providers of labor, which are the essential ingredients for a place. The way we think about people is, there's a lot of different ways, but one way in particular is to think about people in terms of people in place and also people in motion. And if you think about people in motion, that means that we need to think about how to conceptualize migration, moving from one place to another, in and out. And the nice thing is that migration theory, which is a body of research that demographers and economists and sociologists are particularly interested in, is quite well developed, and people actually do in fact behave much like the theories suggest. It's not always the case that the theories that we work with have such predictive capacity, but in the case of migration theory, it does have it's a pretty good gauge of what people do. So in migration theory, what we try to explain is why people move, who moves, and the mechanisms by which they move. There are a couple of handouts on the web that will be valuable to you. One I'm going to mention at the end, and the other is a set of slides that are on contrasting kind of classical migration theory with what's called new migration theory, which is relevant to us in the global north as well as the global south. You just have to think about being one of those people that might be moving. So in terms of migration theory, why do people move? There's two primary reasons. One is lifestyle factors, and those we relate to the individual. Somebody who's divorced or is getting married has a higher propensity to move. Somebody who's at retirement age has a higher propensity to move, but they tend to move back again. So that these are not permanent moves in many cases, but they are movements that are associated with changes in someone's age or life experience. People move when they're in the military. Then we have economic reasons, and they're called pull and push factors. The pull factors are those types of conditions which draw you out of where you are to someplace else. So you have all filled yourselves up with education, and you're going to get pulled towards someplace in terms of a job or other type of opportunity. So jobs and education are these stimulants that kind of draw people away from wherever they are. And then there are also negative or push factors, and those are environmental problems, environmental destruction, political instability, refugees, and at the extreme when the economy is so bad that you're actually pushed out of a place.
Would disasters fall under the environmental?
Right, yeah, disasters are what push people out, and that would be considered environmental. In terms of who migrates, we have these rules of thumb that are pretty accurate until you get down to the individual, and then you have to add all the caveats about, well, is this person a woman or a man? Is this person a Latina or a Bulgarian? So there's ways in which you always have to make adjustments for the finer details of an individual. But in general, what we know is young people move more frequently than old people do. Men move more frequently than women do. Educated people move more frequently than uneducated people do. And people who are engaged in a national labor market, like a doctor, have more geographic mobility than somebody whose labor market is highly specific to a location, like an aerospace engineer. Now, with these statements made, there are things to think about. When you're a child, you move with your parents. When you're 18 or 21, you move on your own. When you're old, you move because you're retiring or you're moving back to your families, right? So there's life changes here. Men move historically more frequently than women because they were the classic wage earners, but we know that in non-Anglo populations, women in particular have high propensity to move, and this is inter-country, and the reason is because the labor markets for the skills that women have are different than men, and actually can, as people become wealthier, women in a country, they tend to demand services that women provide. So housekeepers, maids, and things like that. National labor markets are also important, but you have to realize that a doctor builds up a clientele. So once that phase in their career has happened, there are significant exit costs to actually move, right? So the opportunity cost concept is really important when you think about migration. It's what do you have to give up, where you are, in order to move. And the less you have where you are, the more you think you can gain, the more likely you are to move. Now, what you have to also realize that in a low-wage economy, the least likely people are the people with the lowest skills who can receive the lowest remuneration. They tend to go only when the circumstances are quite dire because they're found everywhere and their composition is viewed as homogeneous. So advantages for them are pretty limited. So they tend to pick up and go when there literally are nothing for them to do. Now, what about skill? When we think about the collapse of the American automobile industry in the early 1980s, lots of men who worked in the automobile industry picked up and moved to the South, believing that there was employment for them there because those economies were growing. The point was that, in fact, that did not turn out to be true, and many of them had to migrate back home. And the reason is because they had what's called specific human capital. Their job skills were tied to the employer that they previously had. So if you're going to think about skills, the more valuable skills are those skills that are called general human capital. Those are skills that are valuable to many different circumstances, and you, as the person with them, control the majority of the value of them. Whereas in specific human capital terms, an employer actually benefits most from those because he's invested in you. That's what specific human capital is. Mechanisms by which migration occurs. We think a lot about something called chain migration, and that is that one person goes in a family, and then they establish a beachhead, and then other members of the family will go. What we also know is that modern migration theory, what we might call new migration theory, suggests that the family doesn't necessarily move. An individual in the family moves and then repatriates income to wherever the household continues to reside. So we see this global flow of funds that are going between the United States and Mexico at about $30 billion a year, or the United States and the African continent for about $15 billion a year. And that is an efficient solution to a paucity of jobs at home, right? So you have a higher income, the person can live where they're working, and they ship income back. So, go ahead.
Just on the mechanism piece, I mean, this might be a minor aspect, but there also are these sort of refugee resettlement programs. So sometimes in some cities you'll get, populations that are relocated, like the Hmong population in Minneapolis, St. Paul, for example, it was kind of the result of a refugee resettlement effort for Vietnamese and Hmongs and things like that. So
right.
You get these sort of unique pockets of populations that get moved into places, out of federal refugee resettlement programs.
Another similar grouping is veterans. So veterans will tend to aggregate around military establishments, and retired veterans will also aggregate around military establishments. The retired veterans, if they retire at 20 years, actually have health care for life and a whole set of other benefits. The veterans who leave the military at a relatively young age will sort of hang out near the base, mainly because their social networks were broken when they left home and were reconstituted near the base, and so they tend to hang together as long as they possibly can. So just so you know, demographics impact social services. versus, how much, what, and why. Infrastructure levels, you know, when you have a boom in population of children, you have to build schools. That's, you know, when the housing boom took place in places like Vegas and in Florida, it wasn't just housing that was built, it was schools and all the other accompaniments. So when the economy collapsed and people were pitched out of the housing market, all of that infrastructure was then sitting there wasting away, which is an enormous social cost. In economic development, we always think about, do jobs follow people or do people follow jobs? And in order to be able to answer that question, there's a set of other factors which we will talk about when we talk about industries, that some industries draw people toward it, and some people draw industries toward them. And it really depends on the characteristics of the individual and the characteristics of the employer.
And also the geography you're talking about, the regional dynamics can be different than the municipal.
Right, so you can have, as work Krista and I've done is, during the financial crisis, you saw big declines in regions that weren't expected, the West and the South, and that would have shoved potentially people in directions toward where the economies were slightly more together in the Northeast in particular, and maybe the Midwest, it's hard to say. So I just want to point out that why demographics really matter and how they are always lurking in the background. There's an article up on the website called "The Aging Baby Boomers and the Coming Housing Crisis." And what it basically says is there's an oversupply of large houses on big lots that people who are in the baby boom generation currently occupy. They're going to want to move out of that and into rental properties, which will change the dynamics in the rental market. And what it will do is it's going to put so many houses on the market of that type at the same time as you're producing people that have less education and therefore will earn less income, that you're going to end up with empty houses, mainly because people can't afford to live in them. So it's an interesting example of thinking about, you could take your place wherever you're studying and basically take this problem and calculate it out. How many people in your community are living in a house of a certain price, age at a certain price, and how many people in your community are actually able to, of a certain age, purchase a house like that. So you can actually do that work yourself. And that's what this article is about.
Yeah, I'd also say that sort of for housing purposes, it's often important to not just think about population projections, but household projections, because it's actually growth in households that generates demand for housing, not just sort of population. So the number and composition of households, and that's something where like an aging baby boom generation is going to have a very different sort of type of household demand for housing and the population growth that's going on families.
Right. Okay, so just so 2 notes on the, or a couple of notes on the assignments. There are 2 assignments for this week. The profile that we've asked you to do, and then your population projections. And there are 2 sheets to work from. One is, as an example, it's all the counties in California. You can see the variation across counties in terms of dynamic, versus the one county versus the one sheet that has the space for one county for you to work on. And then use the PDF on how to find data for the projection, and the link is on Stellar.
Yeah, the link to the data, to the population projection data. So one thing that I could say about the population data is that states tend to collect this population data. You're looking for births, deaths, and net migration to do your projection. And so you need to, the best way to collect data is from the states, but not all states are coordinated in their data processes. So sometimes you can't find it, and we're asking you to find 10 years of data. So you can try looking for your data at the state level. Some states are really good, California, Indiana, there's some other states that are really good. But if yours isn't, you can go to the link that's on Stellar for the census. And the census collects some of that data from the state. You just have to take it year by year from the historical website, okay? And if you run into any problems, that's why I'm here today. So if you can start working on the demographic profile, which is due a week from today, and then the population projection is due the following Friday, so you have more time, and you don't have to write anything about this. But if you want help on the projection, which might be a little harder than the demographic profile, you can work on that now.